Major Denny Whitaker sits down for a drink in a local pub and strikes up a conversation with an American serviceman beside him. Purely by chance, he is an American lieutenant who is involved in the U.S. Army's Recreation Service. They have just received a fresh shipment of rugby football gear, and it was up for grabs. Major Whitaker was a former member of the Hamilton Tiger Cats, called the Ticats if you're a cool dude, and his interest was piqued. The lieutenant's name is lost to time, but the idea was pushed up the Allied chain of command, and they rubber-stamped it. The USA and Canada would go to war on the gridiron in the middle of London. A teapot was to be the trophy, leading to the natural moniker of the Tea Bowl. But this was so much more than just a football game. This was a morale booster, an event of reunion, a continuation of a familiar tradition, a slice of home, and maybe, for Whitaker at least, a bit of rest and relaxation so he could free up his mind from one of the worst Canadian military defeats in the force's storied history. Let's dive into the Tea and Coffee Bowls. It was agreed that the game would be played under the American football rules in the first half and the Canadian rules in the second half. There was a precedent for this as the two systems had clashed before. The earliest series we could find took place on August 26, 1941 to September 10, 1941. The American Football League champions Chicago Bulls took on the Western Canadian champion Winnipeg Blue Bombers. The rule sets were in the same order, American then Canadian. The Bombers would take the first matchup 19-12, but lose the other two 6-0 and 31-1 respectively. With bruised egos, the Bombers would look to other leagues for a test. After all, the AFL wasn't the only league on the continent. On October 4, 1941, they met up with the independent Wisconsin football club, the Kenosha Cardinals. Winnipeg was beaten 18-16 and then 35-6, ending the world dominance ambition of the Bombers. That would be the last time the two systems would clash before the American entry into World War II. A year later, in August of 1942, then Captain Denny Whitaker would be involved in the Dieppe raid. We'll have a solo video on Dieppe one day, but in a nutshell, it's regarded as one of the worst military defeats in Canadian history, and served as a lesson for D-Day. The Canadians and their allies were thrown against the coastal town of Dieppe in hopes that they would gain a foothold into France. It went poorly. Captain Whitaker managed to get his men off the blood-soaked beach and into the local casino, making a desperate escape through a repurposed latrine system. Just boarding the transport off the beach saw more and more men fall. Whitaker needed some reprieve. Thankfully, each player was offered 6 weeks off their military duties to train for the 1944 football game. The lifelong Ticat jumped at the occasion. February 13, 1944, White City Stadium, 2:45 p.m. With RAF support covering the stadium, the T-Bowl was a go. Around 30,000 spectators, mixed military and civilian, flooded the stands. Programs were handed out to explain how the game would be run and the difference between the two systems of play. The opposing teams were the American Pirates, led by Captain, big comma in the middle there, Private First Class, Frank Dombrowski. We're sure there are some other notable people on the American roster, but we aren't the biggest football nerds at Dive In, so we can't speak to who's famous or not. The Canadian Mustangs roster, however, was stacked with a bunch of CFLers. Paul Rowe, called Pappy, was a fullback on a few Calgary pro teams, including the Stampeders. Pappy would call the game one of the greatest experiences in his life. Andy Bieber was part of the Grey Cup winning Blue Bombers that had challenged those American franchises back in '41. Jeff Nicklin was also a Blue Bomber and was part of our video on One Can Para's race to the North German coast to stop the Soviets from advancing into Denmark. Orville Burke helped the Ottawa Rough Riders take down the Toronto Balmy Beach in the 1940 Grey Cup. Holly Huck Welsh had 3 Grey Cup champions with the Hamilton Tigers, not the Ticats. We could go on, but just note that this was an unofficial Canadian all-star team. Despite the star power, the game was pretty boring for the first half. The Americans didn't have the same caliber of players, and the Canadians just needed to play defense until their rules showed up. After a short halftime show with pipers and brass bands, the Canadians took off. With a last-minute touchdown from Jeff Nicklin, the Mustangs took the American Pirates at a score of 16-6. Calls for a rematch were almost instantaneous, but the timing wasn't right. Most of the Canadians were back to their training and duties. The Americans persisted and assembled their own all-star team called the Blue Division. This time centered around Philadelphia Eagle Tommy Thompson and some collegiate athletes. Guys like Whitaker, Burke, and Bieber returned, but they didn't have the muster. On March 19, 1944, in front of 50,000 to 60,000 fans, the Canadian Mustangs lost 18-0, and the Americans took home a decorative coffee pot. The Coffee Bowl, as it was called, was a blowout for the Blues, and the last time some of these men would ever play semi-professional football. The invasion of Normandy happened in June of 44, and the push to the North Sea ended up taking Jeff Nicklin's life. Throughout the war, there would be informal American football matches across Europe. You had the Spaghetti Bowl in Italy between the 5th Army and the 12th Air Force. You had the Lily Bowl in Bermuda between the Army All-Stars and the Navy. You had the Arab Bowl in Oran, Algeria, and the Potato Bowl in Belfast, to name a few. Baseball was also a pretty popular sport to play, being played regularly where the weather was hot. That's partially why Asia is in love with the sport. A second T-Bowl would be played on Christmas Day, 1945, between the American Air Command Warriors and the 8th Air Force Raiders. The Warriors won 13-0. It seems kind of droll that two American teams competed for a trophy won by Canada, but I digress. The war in Europe ended in May of that year, and American football went back to the continent, bringing the two-system competition with it. Since drawing crowds to this odd twin-ruled spectacle was lucrative, why not keep it going? The next game we could find was the Montreal Alouettes versus the Brooklyn Dodgers, August 20th, 1948. No, not those Brooklyn Dodgers, the All-American Football Conference Brooklyn Dodgers. Despite switching up the norm and playing under Canadian rules, then American rules, the Alouettes got smoked 27-1. With pure English exuberance, the Ottawa Rough Riders saw that score and said, "We can do better than those Quebecers." August 13th, 1950, they took on the NFL's New York Giants. Once again, they were absolutely crushed 27-6, technically losing just a little bit better. There was talk of the two teams playing annually, but I doubt Rider management saw that as a good idea. The next year, on August 11th, 1951, the Giants kept their promise and came back to challenge Ottawa. The game ended 41-18 for New York. You're seeing a pattern emerge. There was a decent gap between the double rule games, about 8 years, before the two systems decided to clash again. August 5th, 1959, the Argonauts thought they would have a chance to beat the Chicago Cardinals. The Cardinals steamrolled the Argos 55-26. August 4th, 1960, the Argos once again looked to best their American counterparts, this time the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers took the game 43-16. Maybe Toronto management just liked to lose because the next year, on August 1st, 1961, they went after the St. Louis Cardinals and suffered a 36-7 loss. At least the papers were admitting why these embarrassments were happening. To quote Jim Proudfoot, 2 previous expeditions against US teams have been disasters for Argos. Everywhere except at the box office, where crowds of approximately 30,000 paid regular season prices to watch. The Alouettes took a crack at the Chicago Bears 3 days later, and a predictable 34-16 loss for Montreal was the outcome. Jim Trimble, the coach of the Hamilton Ticats, said it best after the loss. "It doesn't make sense. You gain nothing and risk too much. Let's not kid ourselves, the NFL is too powerful. Why embarrass our players and our fans?" Trimble's own team, the Ticats, played the Buffalo Bills on August 8th of 61, and they actually won, 38-21. Imagine that. A former NFL player turned coach who takes the CFL seriously and plays for love, not money, won the game. Shocker. We think Trimble proved his point, or maybe the money just stopped flowing, because the Ticat win over the Bills was the last time the two systems played against each other. What was once a fairly equal-footed rivalry turned morale booster was now a lopsided shell of a tradition that only the winners and money handlers seem to want. Maybe the two systems will clash again in the future. We highly doubt it, as the gap between player skill has only gotten worse and worse. Don't misquote me. The CFL is a league of skill. It is a pro league. We have some amazing players and coaches, but the money just isn't there to keep the players from searching for bigger checks and warmer fields. Plus, the CFL not being as big isn't a bad thing. In my opinion, the NFL has too much money and is spending it on spectacle rather than sport. The CFL will always be a more pure league full of heart and moxie, and that's why it's the best version of North American rugby football. That's the real win at the end of the day. To us over at Dive In at least. Thanks for watching.